And we're back with our special guest, Alicia Planincic. She is the Manager of Policy, Business Council of Alberta. Alicia, talking now about Canadians investing outside the country, that seems to be rising. Again, it's not bad in and of itself, but it's an indicator of something. You talk about one of the reasons being an uncertain policy landscape, regulatory barriers. Can you elaborate on this concern of yours?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is something that we hear across industries, but certainly especially in the energy industry, which probably will not surprise you. And I think just over the last couple of years is a really good example of just the layering of new policies, new announcements. It's made it very complicated to even know, is my investment going to have a positive, am I going to have a positive return on investment, right? Because we're layering policies on top of, we've already got a carbon tax in place, but now we're also adding other regulations, potentially an emissions cap on the industry, right? And so it's just this, it feels like a constantly moving environment, and businesses just don't know what to expect next or longer term, right? When you're making these investment decisions, you need to know not just what is the policy environment today, but what's it going to look like a couple of years from now or 10 years down the road, right? And so I think that part is very, very unclear, which makes it very difficult to make those big investments. And so I think that's a piece of the puzzle. There is more to it, though. Yeah.
Is the government of Alberta, in some sense, leading the way on reducing regulatory burden and some of these other factors that are depressing inward investment?
I think that the tricky part there is just that so many of the regulations that I'm thinking of here really are federal jurisdiction. And
right.
So the provincial government ultimately is limited in its powers of what it can do to help to support that. I think they're doing what they can, certainly, but they're just quite limited.
Right. Gotcha. Let's take another topic. Again, you're a prolific writer, and we're thankful of that. You talk about the relationship between reducing poverty versus reducing income inequality. Can you unpack that a little bit for our audience?
Yeah, such a hot topic and always tends to be an emotionally charged one, but we decided to look at the data and just see what it says. So there's kind of always been a conversation, or at least over the last few years, about inequality and about it being bad. And so I think there's become an assumption that that's really where policy needs to focus, is not necessarily on lowering poverty, but on decreasing inequality. And so I think we've seen that conversation come up just with some recent tax changes, for instance. And so it led us to wonder, okay, if we look by province, is there any sort of relationship where, do you see that provinces that have lower inequality also have lower rates of poverty, right? Or do you see when an individual province decreases its inequality, do you also see a decline in poverty? And what was interesting looking at the data is there is almost no connection, right? So for instance, Alberta has long had one of the lowest poverty rates, but inequality compared to other provinces, it's, kind of middle of the pack. Nothing really interesting there. Same with when we see provinces lowering inequality, not necessarily does poverty come with it. So I think it was just kind of a theoretical question that we wanted to ask ourselves, but I think it's quite interesting just for policy makers to keep in mind that if your goal is to lower inequality, you're not necessarily going to lower poverty, which, perhaps arguably as an economist matters much, much more than inequality of itself.
Yeah, there are policy implications for that because having been in government myself, I know that, it's kind of easy to focus on, and there are policy tools if you want to redistribute wealth, for instance, to try to tackle income inequality, but you're saying that really has no impact or little impact anyway on poverty results.
For sure. I mean, I think it's very fair to say that at a certain point, inequality can become bad enough that it is a problem, right? If people think that they really do not have a fair shot, then they're not going to pursue higher education or whatever it may be, because they might think that the family that I've born into has more or less determined my destiny, right? So at a certain point, it can become a problem, but we are not there in Canada. And so I think that that's really where our focus needs to lie, is on poverty and how do you raise wages for lower and middle income folks rather than, taking from one group to redistribute, as you said.
And so you would recommend government redefine things a little bit in terms of what they're tackling.
Yeah, I think in terms of focus areas and what matters, and again, this actually goes back to our earlier question or earlier conversation on productivity, right?
Okay.
The reason that productivity matters is the increased wages that it delivers. And that's not just at the high income, that's not just at the low income, that's really
Sure.
across the board, better living standards, right? That's really what matters.